Good, cool. So yeah, I guess to give everyone like a heads up, my name is Robbie Kruszynski. I've been in the crypto space for about 7.5, almost 8 years. I've been in this space professionally for about 5 years. Prior to this, I worked for Consensus. At Consensus, I worked with MetaMask, Fira, Consensus Academy, taught a number of people how to write Solidity, worked with Diligence for a little bit, and then was kind of, along with Truffle and Ganache, was kind of recompiled when all companies eventually kind of rescope into DevRel. So I had the opportunity to work with some really cool people over there at Consensus, and then took the opportunity to lead developer relations at Blockdaemon. So what we are going to do is we are going to talk about what the fuck is DevRel, because a lot of people I don't think know it. Initially, when I made this deck, it was like 50 slides. So I'm saving everyone all of that pain, and we're going to really reel it down, and I want this to be a lot more interactive. So more than anything, I think the point of this slide is to kind of introduce you to the questions that a lot of DevRel people think about, right? And we're going to talk about differences, because ultimately what generally happens is when it comes to developer relations, there are kind of two buckets. There's like evangelists and there's advocates. Advocates are generally going to be more on the community side, and evangelists are going to be more on the technical side. But if you are lead of DevRel, or if you are just like the person that has to like wear, the cymbals between your legs and the bagpipes and like all the, like things at the same time, we're going to talk about like what that looks like. So a couple things we're going to talk about. The agenda is going to be what is DevRel on a high level. So we're going to talk about the overview, the experience, marketing, education, product, and developer success, which I would say is the most important thing. And why is DevRel crucial, and how can it impact a company? We're going to talk about impact issues. How does DevRel assist the company? Or have a little fun story time. And how does DevRel assist the community? Because I think for developer relations, you have to both service, obviously, your company, and you also have to service the community. So we're going to talk about like what these differences are, and how ideally there is a conglomeration between the two of them, where as you service the community, it is ultimately servicing the company. At any point, especially because it's quite intimate, if you have questions or want to just chime in, please. I want to make this more interactive than me just like reading. Okay. So yeah. So part one, how can you summarize DevRel, right? Because everyone doesn't know what DevRel is. I think this middle one in particular is a question I am faced with quite a bit. What do you do here? Sort of thing. And I'm on the right being like, I can do stuff. But DevRel is ultimately like a multifaceted, kind of position in which it touches bases and works with education, marketing, product, and experience, which ultimately points the developer to success, right? There's no product that can actually, in my opinion, become very successful without adoption from developers, right? So how do you entice developers to actually play with your product? How do you get feedback from those developers? How do you make sure that there's a reward system for those developers that are playing with your product? How are you ensuring as a company what you're building is actually what the community wants? And this is what DevRel is all about, is making sure, I'm working for a company and they're doing this thing. Does this thing make sense for everyone? Or do we have to pivot? Or do we have to, consider maybe like small forks or something in like what we're offering? And so this is ultimately what DevRel does. So when it comes to experience, right, developer experience, in my opinion, that's the most important thing. That's the cornerstone of DevRel. So, these are the questions that, I propose to all of you to simmer on, but these are what we constantly think about in DevRel. Is your product being used? Number one, is it being used? How do you know it's being used? Who is it being used by? Are you, is your documentation being used? How do you know the documentation is being used, right? Are you basing it based on pings in terms of your website? Because then you have to look at like heat maps. Because now if you've got 20,000 people that go to your dev docs, but they're on your website for, let's say, 10 seconds, nobody's using your docs. So what has a bigger impact? Having 20 or 30 people spend an hour, hour and a half on your docs? Or does it make sense to have a ton of people, which looks really nice for marketing, but ultimately isn't really servicing anything? Are there interactions between you and the product at hand, right? Are you actually getting that proper feedback, right? And how are you capturing that feedback? Are you asking random people to be like, hey, like play around with this for like 20 minutes and like let us know? Versus are we incentivizing people to turn around and use the tool set and say like, does this make sense? Can you give us proper feedback? And then outside of that, you have to think about incentivizing tools to make sure that they want to participate, right? Is there a developer hub? What does a community look like? Is there a Discord? Is there a Telegram? How active is it? Are people doing anything with this, right? Is there open communication, which leads to the developer hub? Is there proper documentation? You could have people on your docs, but if they get lost on your docs, or if you have the ability to showcase what you're doing with the bearer token and pop that in, are they pulling up 400s or 401s, or are they having issues? Are they getting 200s and like this is like running correctly? So is the documentation correct? If it's not correct, how are you capturing that? And then how quickly are you able to cycle over and make sure that documentation becomes correct quickly, right? So you, as DevRel, and we'll talk about it in a little bit, kind of become this liaison where you're talking to like ground floor devs that are like, oh, I'm actually interested in using this, and like being like, almost putting it on them to be like, part of your responsibility in using this, and I'll ideally create an incentivizing program for you to dive deeper into it, is to tell us how to make this better. And as you help us make this better, our docs get better, and that reduces the stress that's going to happen with developers and playing with tool sets, and or like the tooling or the documentation, and it becomes kind of this like, big flow.
Question?
Yes.
What's your experience? What are the best developer hubs? Like moving away from Discord and stuff like. Discourse forum, is that good enough?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. I think Discourse is okay, it's not great. I don't think there's like a tremendous hub. I think as of right now, one that I really enjoy is README. Not README via GitHub, but like README, like outside of README. So it's like GitBooks. So README is really great because you can really customize in terms of how you're presenting the information, and also have kind of a side panel in which people can make like notes of like, hey, I was like following along with the documentation, was having like issues sort of with this, and you can, ideally be like, oh, thank you so much, like person for like pointing this out, and we'll give you kudos, because you always want to make sure like edited by, and like someone made something around that. So I think README right now, which is, we're adopting it, a few people have adopted it, Alchemy has adopted it, I think QuickNotes has adopted it, and a number of other infrastructure providers have adopted README. It's a little expensive, but I do think it's very robust in terms of what it offers.
Does it exist the concept of, in some companies like DevRels, for internal developers, for the internal community of developers, or is mostly about the
It's mostly external. When it comes to marketing, right, here are more questions. How are you highlighting developers? This becomes a really important question. And when I ask these questions, it's ultimately about the people that are curious to use your tool and to use your product, right? How are you highlighting your tool set, your project, and or your company? What is your outreach strategy? How are you supporting sales? Is there digestible documentation for everyone viewing it? The last one, this one, is a real stumper. Because you have to kind of consider the documentation that you're creating and whom you're catering this towards, right? So if you're going to our institutional or enterprise developers, that's going to look very different from developers that are like, oh, I just want to like play around, or like I'm thinking about using it for having fun. So how can you make your documentation or the tool set applicable or accessible to everyone that has a curiosity? Right, and so this becomes like this question of like, do we make like a tier system depending on like how familiar you are with everything? Do we turn around and try to have like a leveling system? So these are a lot of questions that like DevRel constantly thinks about. But this is where we come into marketing to have alignment. I'm going to talk a little bit more later about where there's alignment when it comes to marketing and highlighting developers. I think, a really cool story that I love that I think brings all of this home, which is going to be toward the end of the presentation. When it comes to education, this is I'm most bullish on, is how are you managing documentation? How often is everything being updated? When you're dealing with product, you're dealing with engineering, and everything is constantly being updated. How often is that documentation being updated? Engineers, for the most part, are busy being engineers, and content is busy doing content, but where is that liaison between the two to make sure that that documentation is being up to date? So now we support new protocols, or now we don't, or now there's a system change in something. How often are we making sure that this is good? Because the company can have excellent solutions and the company can have an excellent product, but if the documentation doesn't successfully represent this as an outsider viewing the documentation, this is all they have, it becomes a huge issue.
Sorry, is there a guide of best practices to actually build the documentation related to the audience that you want to target, of course, right? But
yeah, no, that's a really good question. There are a couple books that I'm going to be happy to recommend to you that I think like really express some good. They're actually all like DevRel books. It's like all I read are DevRel books. Super fun. It's like reading a dictionary. But there isn't a standard practice when it comes to like making sure that happens. And regardless of, and I'm part of a couple of channels that are all DevRel, and each company I know, be it Polygon or Solana or Blockdaemon or Consensus or 1inch or anybody, everyone kind of has like a different way that they flow with like DevRel, and that's why I think we should like talk about like what is DevRel, because depending on the company that you work for, you might be bucketed somewhere. Like a lot of people, I think, initially want to put DevRel into marketing. I would say that doesn't make a lot of sense. Working in tandem with marketing makes sense, but ultimately developer relations should work, in my opinion, closer to product and engineering and report back to marketing to let them know what's going on, but should not be under the umbrella of marketing.
Okay,
And
you are kind of like the bridge.
Yes, yeah, a liaison. Yeah, absolutely. So you essentially are that bridge, because generally developer relations is going to have the ability to talk to engineers, because hopefully there's some technical prowess that they have, and they have the ability to talk to sales. Because in the past, you've seen perhaps some conflict with sales and content and marketing and engineering and product all trying to talk to each other. They kind of have a hard time communicating. So DevRel kind of comes in and they're like, I can talk to everybody. Let me help mitigate this conversation and make sure that everything is like known to everyone. So we're all on like a similar page. So like, I can speak to a dev because I know how to write code. I can talk to marketing because I am familiar with marketing, so you kind of become like elastic when it comes to the information that you have to provide. And so I think this is where there's a big hurdle when it comes to like the fuck is DevRel, because we're like that weird person that has to talk to everybody. And so sometimes people just be like, I don't know where you should live. And the answer is we should kind of live on our own, but be more siloed with engineering and product, because we could have a bigger influence there, and constantly inform marketing to make sure that they're aware of what's going on, and we can congratulate contributors, and we can highlight people, and ultimately everyone can like win out of this. What's the target audience? Do you have, are you able to have a large spread with outreach? This again kind of like leads up to, who is the person you're like leaning toward, right? But this is where product and education and content have to align. So this, I constantly have conversations with our product team. We are always working on our education, and we're working with content to make sure that we have the ability to have a big spread, because we don't necessarily want to isolate anybody that is curious to use any tool. I mean, this isn't specifically about the company that I work for, but I would say it would be any company. The last thing you want to do is go and isolate somebody that's curious, right? You always want someone that's like, oh, I want to learn more, to have the ability to learn more. So product, right? Is your product being used? That's a really good question. And there are a multitude of ways in which you can actually see if your product is being used. Some of them, I think, can have weight, and some of them can not necessarily have weight, right? And this is something that, not to go on like a side tangent, but something that we are thinking about a lot in DevRel is the idea of weight of contribution. There's actually a program called Orbit.love. I think they do a really good job. They've been around for a bit. The guy, I think his name is Josh, founded it. I think it's Josh. Most of it's being recorded. Sorry if it's not Josh. But the idea of it is, if you have somebody that, let's say, retweets everything your company does, right? That's great. That's super cool, right? But then you have somebody that, let's say, submits a PR that's then pushed into prod. What has a bigger impact, right? So now you have somebody that retweeted 20,000 tweets versus somebody that committed, some code that's actually pushed into prod. You would argue the second. So it can't necessarily be by the amount, but it has to deal with the weight in which it impacts the product and the company. right? And so we often like think about like, well, what is the weight behind the effort of the people that are curious to do it? So are you on Telegram? Are you on Discord, on Gitter, on Rocket, on CT? Are you submitting PRs? Are you doing this? Are you doing that? Like, you've got to figure out a way to like kind of compartmentalize these and congratulate all of them, but also recognize like, oh, some of these people are like putting in like heavy work, whereas some of them are like doing really good work, but it is a lower lift because ultimately anyone can write a Python script and retweet anything with like an anon, Twitter handle. Are there interactions between you and the product at hand? This is a big one. This one is super big. Generally, what I've seen happens is the product is launched, there's a bunch of press around it, everyone is very excited about it, but how are we getting feedback behind how that's being interpreted? How is that being used? Right? A conversation I was having a bit earlier is if you were to release product that does A, and you give it to the world, and now you have a bunch of devs that are like, oh, cool, but it turns out they can also do B, and now the devs are like, oh, B is a little more interesting than A, and that never goes back to A, never goes back to the product team. They're going to continue to iterate on A, and then all the developers are going to be like, no one's listening to us, we actually prefer it for B, so they're going to just stop using it. So you can have a great product, but if you don't have a proper feedback loop, then you don't get that feedback, and your product ultimately fails or it just dwindles.
There's a nice point there for the AB thing on that story. I'm not going to say names, but also there's conversations we might not see as public. Like on crypto Twitter, on Twitter, you see everyone against B,
right.
But then actually the product team goes, hey, our customers have been asking for A for like 5 years. Right. So sometimes the voices you hear, the loudest voices, aren't necessarily the majority voices.
Totally agree, right? And depending on the product that you're releasing and the audience that it's like geared toward, because for the most part, CET isn't so much institutional or enterprise, right? That's a little more like behind closed doors. And so like the product you're doing for A is like fantastic, but then on like crypto Twitter, you might see like everyone's like, oh, I want B, and they're not listening to us. A is still very successful, but now you have this like maybe tarnished or like weird reputation that can exist, and CT can have weight to it, even though I think most of it is like fluff. But it is a dilemma that you always have to keep in mind. So is there a developer hub? Is there open communication? Is there proper documentation? I mean, we talked about this previously, but this is so, between education and between product, there is a lot of interlacing between the two of them, right?
I'm sorry, and in that process, how is the process actually to get this proper feedback from the people, from the community? Because actually, it's not like, let's say, scalable, right? Because for example, you are one person,
Sure.
and you have to talk, I don't know, with maybe hundreds of people that is actually trying to use the product and try to give you some feedback.
Right.
So actually, how is the way to actually to perform that process of talking to many people, or I don't know, is a mechanism to do that, to get all that feedback?
Yeah, so there's a few ways to go about it. One thing ideally, here's a scenario, right? I release a product and I want to host a boutique hackathon, and I want to have X amount of people use my product, give me feedback. This can be very tangible because I have the ability to do this and I can capture all that feedback. Odds are within that group, and it always happens at hackathons, there's always going to be a few teams that really go above and beyond, and they really try to deliver. So what you have to do is you have to kind of congratulate them, and be it a 721 or 1155 that gives them access to TG channels or Discord channels, or you create an ambassador program. You really try to elevate them as individual contributors or ICs to be like, hey, this is fantastic. We want, your team won the hackathon. Let's turn around and let's do a blog post about you. Let's highlight you on Twitter. Let's do we'll get your picture, we'll do a power quote. Let's elevate your reputation, right? Because ultimately in Web3, I think, especially as a developer or any company really, reputation is very important. So what you want to do is you want to continue to elevate that person and to build their reputation. And when you do that, you can kind of ask, because if you're going to ask for something, you kind of have to give something. So it's like, hey, let's highlight your code, let's highlight your project, let's highlight your team, let's highlight you, let's really try to get you deeper into the space. And an ask I would have is, in your geolocation or maybe in your circle, do you want to help run the next hackathon? And you kind of take, so that's called like a snowflake model. So like, I would be the central point, and ideally I would get 3 people around me to be like, no, I can help you do this. And those 3 people have to find replacements for them. And they have to find replacements for them. So it like arches out, and so it has a scalability effort that to an extent doesn't necessarily mean now you've hired a ton of people, right? Because I talked to, forgive me, I forget his name, but one of the head of DevRels for Solana, and he has a great rep, and Solana obviously has a huge community. And I was like, how did you build the community like so robustly? And he's like, I found everyone on Discord and and everyone that was like really contributing, gave them X amount of money. And it's like, oh, okay, cool, but what if you didn't have the money to give?
Yeah.
What if you had to figure out a way where there wasn't a monetary gain? And it becomes a big question of like, well, how do you incentivize people to like openly contribute without just being like, here's more money, because the well can dry, right? So it's a question that people consistently think about. But this is where product and content have to have alignment. Specifically when it comes to how DevRel affects product. So when it comes to success, what is developer success and what does it mean? You're working with the community to foster a healthy environment for them to ask questions and explore. You're elevating those that want to apply themselves. As I mentioned, if you're creating an ambassador program, you are diligent about ensuring that they have the tools to do so. You are constantly in communication with everyone that is actively like, I want to do more. You want to give them more. You always want to fuel the people that want to do it. If you leave people on red, you've got a window of maybe a week before they're somewhere else, right? And you might have lost a great opportunity to like have like really good influence with people simply because, it's tricky. And to your point, it's hard if you're one person or if you're a small team, it's really, really hard to like manage this. So you've got to be like really creative on like ways where you kind of capture this information, be it in a form, or, you let them know that there's a certain staccato that's going to be followed. Like, here's my email, I respond within a week, and, just like bear with me, we're figuring this process out. These could be like good ideas, but to ultimately just try to stay on your phone all day, you're never going to get any work done because Telegram is just going to like blow your fingers out. So, it's really, really tricky. But, the big thing is you elevate those that want to elevate themselves. This is a big one. This is a super, super big one. When you highlight talent, be it long or short tail, as long as the feedback is given to the team and you highlight individuals, there's always a success story. So if you have somebody that enters a hackathon, they give you feedback and they're like, this was really cool, I loved it, here's my feedback for whatever product I was using, be it RPC or whatever the case is, or I was like playing around with like your tools. And you capture that feedback, and then afterward they drift away, that's okay. You don't necessarily have to chase people, because that can also be kind of a weird look. Like, you want to encourage them to be like, if you want to contribute more, here's an opportunity, like here's an ambassador program. But if they're just like, no, I just wanted to do this hackathon, give the information and walk away, that's okay. But there's still success. They used your product, you got feedback from that product, and that's great. When it comes to people that are like, oh, actually, I want to do more, that's where you like dive deeper. But there is almost a way where you can like shield that realm, and it's, I think, a very gross look. Like, you don't want to like hunt people down. You want to make sure that, you don't want to convince someone that dinner's good. You just want dinner to be good, right? And if dinner's good, they're going to eat it. But if I'm going to sit here and tell you for 30 minutes why this turkey is so delicious and it's dry, they're going to be like, thanks, and then leave and never come back. So just make sure it's good, and you'll generally have people that are coming back. So the community in itself, when it comes on their activation or their feedback or how willing they are to stay with you, is going to directly tell you, is your product actually working? And if I'm sitting here pulling teeth to get people to use it, then there's a problem with the product, right? And so that in itself, almost not getting feedback is still feedback. So impacts and issues. So developer dilemmas. What is easy right now? There's a ton of tools. Devs are in demand. Code friction is reduced, right? Open Zeppelin is a great example. Open Zeppelin with their contract wizard is insanely cool. Remix IDE is unbelievably cool. Like, this stuff is from like 5 years ago, so much better than it ever was. Education and community available for reference is everywhere. There's a bajillion things on YouTube. There's Filmatics, there's DAP University, there's all the documentation across like a multitude of products that are like, here's everything you need. And so no one really has an excuse if they really want to learn to know what's going on. The hard part, space is always evolving. So you always have to be abreast in terms of what's happening. There's always a new iteration, or it's like, oh, we're using Truffle. And it's like, oh, now we're using Hardtap. It's like, oh, no, now we're using Foundry. And I'm sure in 6 months it'll be something else, right? So always staying on top of that can be a lot of fatigue for developers, because it's, if you are getting comfortable with one thing and now all of a sudden everyone's like, oh, I don't use that anymore. It's just like, it's really difficult. What lang or projects to focus on? This could be hard, right? Should you learn Rust? Should you learn Solidity? Should you learn Go? Should you learn Java, C++, or TypeScript, JavaScript? All of them, none of them, Python. Like, it becomes like overwhelming. So this is a huge problem for developers. There's a higher competition for work. While, I know that these kind of feel like they're kind of combating each other, there are definitely devs in demand, but because they're in demand, there's a lot more people coming in, especially as we saw in like off round that just happened, and I don't think we're in a bear market personally, but as we've seen a little bit of a downturn, and a lot of companies have restructured and laid people off. Now you have people from LinkedIn, from Google, from Uber, that are just coming into the space, and now they're really curious to join the space as well. So now you're competing with like a different bucket of people. And sometimes, being a paper dragon, you could be a very good Web3 dev versus someone that worked for Alphabet for 5 years. Odds are the recruiter is going to probably look at them a little more, which is unfortunate, because it's like, well, I'm a great Web3 dev. I've done all these hackathons. I've gotten a couple of grants and all this, but they're like, yeah, they work for Google. So, it becomes like a bit of a problem. So that's where the competition comes in. Also, crypto, Twitter, Telegram, Discord noise for a source of truth is a nightmare, right? Trying to navigate and find out what is real and what isn't real based on people shilling their own projects, or bot attacks, or just noise that's constantly happening can be like really difficult for people that are coming into the space. I know a majority of us here have been in the space for a bit, and it's still just like overwhelming to see how many Telegram things happen, how many Discord things happen, where like, let me tell you about my new project. And so imagine if you were like 2 weeks old in the space and you're just trying to figure out what's going on. It's insane, right? So it becomes really, really difficult. So trying to find a central point of truth, or at least an aggregator of aggregators where you can have a little more reliance on that information, becomes really important, right? And this is a huge developer dilemma. And when it comes to expectations or projections, are generally not aligned with leadership. Leadership always wants everything now, and they don't necessarily understand perhaps some of the technical debt behind it, or some of the roadblocks that can happen behind it.
Would you say that part of your role as dev rel is also to follow the evolving space and tell developers, like, guys, that's out of date, or update your thing?
Yeah.
MetaMask, RPC, whatever.
Absolutely.
So that's part of your role as well, to keeping sure the devs are on the right page with the most modern thing.
Absolutely. A really good example of that is, last year, for a whisper of time, a couple hours, Infura went down, right? And so when Infura went down, MetaMask went down. And all you had to do was change your RPC provider to switch over and to stop using Infura. Nobody did this because no one knew, oh, that's what I have to do, right? And so this became like a huge issue when it came to like, there's a lack of knowledge when it comes to people using one of the most popular wallets, not understanding like you could just like switch the RPC provider that you're using to go ahead and make